Hey guys, welcome to the Balance Lens, where we examine faith, culture, and politics from a balanced perspective. I say balance because we try to lay out the facts, offer pragmatic analysis, put aside our personal opinions, and apply a biblical Christian worldview. The topic for today is really fascinating. We're talking about American foreign policy. And if you didn't know, there's a document that every presidential administration releases that outlines a framework of their own foreign policy. And the document is called the National Security Strategy. And so back in November 2025, the second Trump administration released their version of this document outlining a framework of how they view the world and American foreign policy. Encourage you guys, if you're listening at home, it's an easy read. It's a long read, but it's an easy read, very straightforward. If you have nothing to do this weekend, encourage you guys, open up a website, read it. It'll help you understand the framework through which our current Trump administration is viewing the world. And we're here to offer a balanced perspective. And so this document starts off with a question. It says, what exactly is American strategy? And so we'll start there. What is American strategy and what is a strategy?
So, this document, like you said, I would encourage all of our listeners to do a quick read. It's like 29 pages long, but it's a really good read that helps us understand why we as a country, we are doing what we are doing and the way we are engaging with the world around us. So, obviously, the strategy, it starts off with talking about how we want the US to be the strongest, richest, most powerful, and most successful country, not just for now, but for decades to come. And for that, they're trying to create a framework on how we interact with the world. So they talk about how we need to have, when we talk about a strategy that is realistic, we connect the ends and the means together. So it's an assessment of what we desire, what tools are available to us, right? And how can we realistically get there? And the really good thing about this document, how it starts breaking it up, is like it starts off with the US, and it goes very consistent with the theme that the president and the administration talks about: America first. Everything is about protecting the national core interest. That is the focus. And around that theme, everything gets built up. So that is how to interpret the US strategy. It's America first, not America only. We are and should, the document argues, engage with the world, but you should engage pragmatically and make sure that when we engage, our strategy should be based on what we can realistically do with what we have in order to achieve what we want.
Yeah, and explicitly, what's interesting, the definition of a strategy is provided by the document. And we'll explain why this is important in a second. But on page one of the document, the wording says this: a strategy is a concrete, realistic plan that explains the essential connection between ends and means, begins from the accurate assessment of what is desired and what tools are available or can realistically be created to achieve the desired outcomes. What's interesting, if you contrast this with in the past, for decades, U.S. strategy rested on this idea that America would lead a liberal international order, promoting free markets, democracy, open trade. And what's unique about this is that it returns to a more explicit, nation-centered, America first definition of strategy. Instead of saying who should lead and uphold the global system, the framing shifts to, well, how does every policy decision tangibly affect American security, American workers, American sovereignty? And so what's interesting, the strategy becomes less about managing the world and more about defending America's national concrete interests. Here's another reason why it's important to define strategy. Many people look at American foreign interventionism or American foreign policy and they say, because America is not involved in every single African civil war or every international conflict or every South American crisis, that America is this ethnocentric, racist, colonial power that only wants to plunder the nations around it. But interestingly, in this document, it clearly and explicitly says that a strategy must evaluate, sort, and prioritize not every country, region, issue, or cause. Very specific in this document. We're not going to fix every problem of the whole world. And just because we don't doesn't mean we're a racist nation. Right? That's a very common accusation that's posed toward American foreign policy. And so important. We define strategy, we define what exactly we're trying to achieve here through this document. Now, as this document goes on, it enters into this really important question. How did American strategy go astray? And how is this a departure from previous frameworks of foreign policy?
Very important point to consider, because you need to know where you came from, how you got here, to then start charting a path on where you want to go, right? So it starts with acknowledging that our approaches since the end of the Cold War in 1992 have actually fallen short, right? We have had so many wishes and desires. By the way, when I look at this realistically and from an empathetic lens, I understand the euphoria that people experienced when the Cold War ended. We were entering into a new era where anything was possible. We could all join hands as one world citizens and lift each other up. So this was a mindset, right? I just want to acknowledge that because it's easy for us to kind of people to scoff at it, but that is not an unreasonable way to have your mind. Think about being in Cold War for like what? 4 decades and you just came out of it. That's exactly the way I would feel. So that's how it starts. The document starts that way. And then it talks about how at that point, well, US was the sole superpower, right? The elites at that time started saying, okay, let's make sure that America is the permanent dominating power in the entire world. And that is what's best for our country. That's a tall ask. I know it's easy to say it at that time when we were the sole power, but to think that there would be no other power that arises was a little too good to be true. And that's exactly what happened. Then what happened is then we start looking, and so once you start thinking like we want America to be the dominant power, we start miscalculating how easy it is to engage the world and bring them to this euphoric state that we are in. Democracy, free speech, everybody can vote, women can dress how they want. Like, we want the whole world to be like us, right? Just enjoy life like we do in the US. I understand why somebody would think that. But when you look back, you're like, how would that even be possible, right? So what have we learned? We have learned that we do not have infinite resources to fund forever wars. We cannot force a country to be democratic. This is not easy. And by the way, just a quick side tangent. To me, it gives me more admiration to the founding of this country and the documents that founded this country and the strong institutions we have in place. When you see how difficult it has been over the last few decades to force and encourage other nations to be like us. So we miscalculated that, right? We overestimated our ability to influence and to overregulate and to make everything like use foreign aid. Like, we cannot be everywhere every time. We cannot solve every war in Africa, every war in the Middle East. We cannot keep toppling regimes and again, some of these are lessons learned. It's easy in hindsight to blame people. We did not know at that point if we toppled Saddam Hussein in Iraq, it would become what it was, or Libya, right? But we have learned our lessons. We have seen that just because you take away someone doesn't mean the country comes into a great position. Most often, there's civil war and it goes into more unrest. So that's what it talks about. It talks about how we miscalculated all those elements. We also thought that now we open up free trade, like, this concept of free trade. Everybody is opening up their markets, sharing wealth and trading freely. What we miscalculated is that people will stop being selfish human beings and they will not act in their own self-interest. So we said free. What we should have said is free and fair. So we miscalculated there. We also miscalculated in that, and by the way, this has been decades in the making. Our allies, especially NATO, right? There's a miscalculation that they would participate in building a strong military and a strong NATO, and they did it. And every president, Bush, Obama, Biden, everybody has been asking and begging them to increase their spend. So this has been a miscalculation on our end, right? Like, even our own allies would not try to get to the same level we need so that we can resolve global conflicts together. So that was a problem. And then with all the associations and the institutions, the international institutions that were being formed, there was a dilution of individual state sovereignty and the desire of the actual people who elected these governments and put them in place. There was a dilution of that. There was almost this attitude that the elites knew better than the common people who voted the people into office. So all those were the ways like we went astray. The document talks about how we went astray.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I think for many average Americans who've, like over 35, 40, and you've been through several presidents, strategy went astray when US leaders pursued these ambitious global projects, right, without a clear defined timeline or budget. And you did a fascinating job tying the Cold War into this because after the Cold War ended, it was as if, all the nations of the world want to hold hands, get together, sing songs, and the world's going to be a happy place. There was this optimism, which ultimately hurt America. And so, one thing the document mentions implicitly, explicitly, long wars, in Afghanistan and Iraq. If you lived through these things, we were in Afghanistan for like 10 years. And at the end of it, we literally gave the country back to the Taliban and billions and trillions of dollars spent in wars, expanding commitments, trade policies that hollowed out domestic manufacturing, that created this sense that global stability was important to American prosperity. For example, if you grew up like in the 90s, you remember NAFTA. That was a big thing, right? Free trade with Mexico and Canada and then other parts of the world. Ultimately, these things were detrimental to American manufacturing and American cities. Our strategy became very vague, became very moralized, very abstract, and very disconnected for average American workers. I've mentioned this before, but if you live in a big city and you take a train through inner cities, you see factories broken down, run down because these jobs have went to other countries. And so this particular document in Trump's second term, it rejects much of these models. It says that America's overextension weakened our own country, and that a country needs to secure its borders, its supply chains, and its industrial base to lead effectively abroad. And so it talks about immigration. It talks about strong borders. It talks about strong supply chains. Post COVID or during COVID, we knew how our own supply chains in America were impacted greatly. It talks about a strong industrial base, and all these as points where our national strategy really went astray. And so this document is very explicit, right? The correction here is very blunt. Fewer vague missions, fewer open-ended interventions, more focus on real outcomes that Americans can feel, that translate to jobs, energy independence, safety at home. What's also interesting, this document explicitly leaves out rules-based alliances and rules-based pledges to organizations. NATO, the UN, the WTO, the International Monetary Fund. I think people have become sick after the Ukraine war in defending other wars in other countries that are so far away. And I give the specific example of the Ukraine-Russia war, right? We have NATO members in Europe. Now America suddenly it was forced to really pay much of the cost of this war. The American taxpayer was really financing so much of this war. Now, what's interesting, if you look at the war in Europe, which will blow your mind away, you look at how much countries spent per GDP. The nations closest to Ukraine were spending 1 to 2% of their GDP, which is a high number. And countries like France and Spain, much farther away from the war, were hardly spending anything at all. And one of the commitments this document talks about, which we'll get into, is this 5% GDP defense spending per country. And so it's really a departure from rules-based alliances. It's implicitly saying we don't want to fund a war for NATO and end up overpaying our cost of this war, and we're going to make sure that other countries, especially our allies, are held accountable to this. So really fascinating points in this document, which we want to get into. But the next section goes into our own strategy of what we want as a country. And the question is asked in section 3 of this document, what should the United States want? And that's a fascinating and deep question that we'll try to dig into. And so what should we want as a country? What exactly are we aiming for here?
So this again, I would encourage everyone to look at this document. It's very, very clear and simple. It's very simply laid out for the common man, for the common person. So first and foremost, obviously, we want to have continued survival and safety of our country as a sovereign, independent republic, right? Who ensures that and it talks about God-given natural rights of its citizens and prioritizes their well-being and interests. So it's very clear that that should always be first and foremost, by the way, of any government, of any country in the world, but it states that, number one. We want to protect the country. It talks about wanting to protect the country from any threat, its territory, its people, economy, way of life, whether through a military attack, hostile foreign interference, espionage, anything, including drug and human trafficking and destructive propaganda that other people and spy and other enemy countries try to inject into the US. It talks about wanting full control of our borders, right, over our immigration system, transportation networks. Everything should be orderly. And it talks about how we should ensure, like, we want to ensure that migration is properly thought through, right? It's not just orderly, but we are ensuring that it is happening correctly for the US interests and our benefit, and also preventing any destabilization that happens with different types of population flows into the US. It talks about having the need to have a national infrastructure which is resilient and can withstand natural disasters and foreign threats. It talks about how we want to have the most powerful, lethal, and technology advanced military in the entire world, so we can quickly and decisively win with the lowest amount of casualties. It talks about how we want a very strong nuclear deterrent, because that's going to be very, very important in this modern world. And it also talks about the golden dome that protects the American homeland. It talks about having a very vibrant, strong, dynamic, innovative economy, which is the bedrock of our American way of life, that enables everyone to push upward, right? So it's talking about gives everyone a way, and it also provides a merit-based approach to rewarding people and hard work. It talks about how we want to make sure we want to have a very robust industrial base, because having a robust industrial base actually is critical to have a strong defense production capacity in times of any danger. It talks about having a very vibrant and strong energy sector, because that kind of fuels our economic growth as well. It talks about having the most scientifically and technologically advanced country on earth, and we want to protect our intellectual property from any type of foreign theft. And then finally it wraps up with making sure that we have unrivaled soft power, talking about and this is where this paragraph talks about US being unapologetic about our country's past and present, and also respecting other countries' differing religions, cultures, governing systems. So it explicitly says, like, don't try to force somebody to be like us because we think we are better, right? But it also says, what it's implying is, stop apologizing and throwing trash on yourself about the past. Acknowledge it, embrace it, and move forward. And in the final paragraph, it's really cool how it talks about invigorating the American spiritual and cultural health, which is very important. It talks about cherishing past glories and heroes and looking forward and being optimistic and proud and happy. And it also talks about the importance of having strong traditional families that raise healthy children for the sake of our future and the thriving of this generation and the generations to come.
Yeah, excellent summary there. And one of the main criticisms of this section was actually the section on immigration. There were a litany of tirades. People were pretty furious about this particular paragraph, and I'll read it to you from the document. We want full control over our borders, over our immigration system, and over transportation networks through which people come into our country legally and illegally. We want a world in which migration is not merely orderly, but one in which sovereign countries work together to stop rather than facilitate destabilizing population flows and have full control over whom they do and do not admit. So, not controversial to me, but it was very controversial to those that read through this document, that we would list immigration as a national security issue. Makes sense to the average person. Most people were not in favor, whether you're Republican or Democrat, of an open border. And so that was explicitly mentioned in this document. I thought it was interesting, as you mentioned, the talk of a robust industrial base, the talk of robust technological sectors. If you think about it, those are important to national security and a national strategy. And I think there are some key events that really shaped the American psyche over the last 20 years, right? Obviously, the wars in Afghanistan, the wars in Iraq, and COVID was huge, reminded us of the importance of supply chains. The Ukraine Russia war reminded us the importance of strong allies and cost sharing and taking their burden of the cost. And so much of the strategy, I think, has been formulated from these major events that have happened to all of us in the last 20 years. But as you mentioned, a fascinating point, the last paragraph talks about the importance of strong traditional families to raise healthy children. Reading verbatim, it says this: finally, we want the restoration and reinvigoration of American spiritual and cultural health. This cannot be accomplished without growing numbers of strong traditional families that raise healthy tradition. Now, this is not anti-LGBTQ. This is not like anti-trans. This is saying that to produce a child, you need a man and a woman. That's a traditional family, right? That's the assertion. That's the fundamental bedrock of any society, a strong traditional family. And so interesting that this is laid out in the National Security Strategy document of the United States. I think it's good. It's healthy to list that as a point here. So this is what the United States is pursuing. But there's also a section here where we explicitly state, what do we want from the world? How is our position in the world different? And what is the framework for that?
Yeah, so given what we've stated, what we want to achieve, what we want from what we aspire. Now we talk about what do we want from the world. So it talks about a few items over here. Number one, and this is where the Don Raw doctrine comes into play, or it's also called the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So, number one, we want to ensure that the Western Hemisphere remains reasonably stable. So, it talks about being reasonably stable and well governed enough to prevent and discourage mass immigration to the US. It's very interesting that's how it says it. It doesn't talk about everything being overhauled and made democracy. It's very pragmatic in the way it chooses the words. It talks about wanting governments in the Western Hemisphere to cooperate with us against narco terrorists and cartels and other transnational criminal organizations, free from any hostile foreign incursions and ownership of key assets. Think about what happened to the Panama Canal, into the entry and the exit ports in the Panama Canal, with China starting to control those territory. Think about how Russia is heavily intertwined in Cuba. Think back to the Cuban missile crisis, so you'll understand why this is an important thing. Like the assertion of the document is like, we got scattered in our focus to the entire world and forgot that to take care of our own hemisphere. That's what it says. So number one, it talks about the Western Hemisphere. Two, it talks about halting and reversing any ongoing damage that foreign actors have inflicted on our economy, and making sure that the Indo-Pacific is free and open, right? So the idea is to make sure that all the crucial sea lanes are all free and nobody's taking anybody ransom in there. Then the third point, it talks about supporting our allies in preserving the freedom and security of Europe while restoring Europe's civilizational self-confidence and Western identity. Now, this was again understandably controversial, but the document suggests that this is very important. And Marco Rubio, in his recent address in Munich, mentioned this, how America and Europe are joined together in a way that is unique. And he called America the child of Europe, and that we are connected by our historical bond because we are one people. There is a bond of like raw DNA bond. It's as simple as that. It's a family blood bond, and this document talks of preserving the European security and freedom in that sense, and the self-confidence, because the idea here is that Europe has probably gone a little too far in the way it is thinking, and how there's a lot of issues happening in Europe within its society. So this is providing a correction to that. The fourth one, it talks about we want to prevent an adversarial power from dominating the Middle East, to make sure that any choke points in terms of the key straits, oil and gas supplies, we do not want anyone to threaten that or take that into ransom. But we also want to make sure that we don't get involved in forever wars and get entangled in that spot. And finally, it talks about ensuring the US technology and our standards, especially in AI, quantum computing, biotech. We are dominating and driving the world forward, and we expect this is what we want as we interact with the world.
Yeah, really fascinating, right? And to summarize one key point that you said, as a nation, we are not trying to remake other societies. We're not trying to bring democracy to a communist nation. We are not trying to bring free elections to a monarchy. That is no longer American foreign policy. That's important. A major distinction from the past. The priority becomes shaping external behavior. What countries do, not necessarily their beliefs or their traditions. Trump's second administration is openly more transactional. Allies are valued, but they're expected to contribute much more. Now, the Monroe Doctrine is fascinating. Many people think, well, a war should only be fought if you're sitting at, I don't know, Atlantic City or Seaside Heights and you have binoculars and you see like a foreign ship coming and then you shoot, right? When they're like 5 miles off your border. The Monroe Doctrine says, hold up, anything in the Western Hemisphere is vitally important for American national security. If you don't know, there are nations that can fire intercontinental ballistic missiles across the ocean and literally knock out any major city on the East Coast or the West Coast or even in the central portions of the United States. And so the Monroe Doctrine is important. If you look at Venezuela, many people ask, well, why were we in Venezuela? Why did we send so much of this flotilla into the coast of Venezuela and have essentially overthrew the Maduro government? It's important to understand, Russian, Chinese, Iranian assets were in Venezuela. And so the Monroe Doctrine played into this foreign policy decision. So important to understand that. As you mentioned, Biju, these points talk about the importance of preventing an adversarial power from dominating the Middle East, its oil and gas supplies, and the choke points through which they pass while avoiding the forever wars. If you listen to the news and it's February 2026, there's a huge military buildup of American war assets around the Middle East. I mean, it's the biggest buildup since the early part of the century when we were fighting wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so fascinating. You read this document, you can understand what is some of the thinking behind the potential invasion of Iran that's going to happen, which we'll talk about in another episode. But really fascinating to understand and read through this document and understand that. Another thing that's really interesting that is mentioned here is it talks about supporting Europe, as you mentioned. It talks about supporting their self confidence, which I think was a very interesting phrase, especially post Russia, Ukraine, the invasion there. Europe almost became paralyzed with fear until America came in. Um, could Ukraine have survived without American help? Probably not. Would Germany or the UK or France have had sufficient power to really step in? Probably not. And so I thought that phrasing of restoring European civilizational self confidence was very interesting and very calculated. What's also interesting, that last phrase there in this section of what the United States wants from the world is really to ensure that US technology and standards in AI, biotech, and computing, which is an industry many people have not heard of, but quantum computing could revolutionize the tech industry much more than AI could possibly do, because it would essentially change how every single technological piece of equipment works. So I thought it was interesting that that's mentioned here in this document. But as we conclude, we're halfway through this document. We're going to have another episode on this because it's a foundational bedrock of understanding U.S. foreign policy, especially as we likely look to some type of foreign military involvement in Iran, as we look to these continuing conflicts around the world. Really fascinating to understand what is the perspective of the current administration and the foreign policy and the framework that they are trying to achieve. And so we'll end there. We encourage you guys to like and subscribe to our podcast. We'll be out soon with a few more episodes talking through American foreign policy, Iran, and everything else going around the world and in the nation. Thanks for tuning in, guys.